The sun had barely risen over the still waters of the lake when I parked my truck near the old family cabin, a place that had stood in my family for generations and was more than just timber and nails. It was a refuge, a sanctuary from the chaos of the world, and now, oddly enough, the venue for one of the most important meetings of my life. I had invited AU's district judge to come out here, away from the courtroom, away from prying eyes, away from the artificial stiffness of legal proceedings, to discuss something that had escalated far beyond neighborly disputes or even the boundaries of local governance, the tyranny of the HOA. Now, when I say HOA, I don't mean the well-meaning board members you sometimes hear about, people who care about trimming hedges and repainting mailboxes. I'm talking about an association that had metastasized into a bureaucratic nightmare with rules piled on top of rules, enforced not with common sense, but with petty vindictiveness. At the center of it all was a woman who had become the very embodiment of that spite, the infamous Karen, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, who believed her clipboard and laminated handbook gave her authority that rivaled the Constitution itself. As I unloaded the files and thick binders of correspondence I had prepared for the judge, I could already feel the tension in the air, like the pressure that builds before a storm. The judge arrived shortly after, stepping out of his car with the calm dignity of someone who had seen every manner of absurdity in court, but perhaps never expected to mediate something as surreal as an HOA feud. He was an older man, his hair silver, but his presence commanding, his eyes sharp and analytical, scanning the peaceful scenery of the lake as though weighing the irony of discussing civil liberties in a place that seemed untouched by conflict. We shook hands, firm and respectful, and I led him inside the cabin, which I had tidied for the occasion, though its rustic charm meant it would never look like a sterile boardroom. Instead, the wooden beams, the stone fireplace, and the view of the lake gave the meeting an atmosphere of grounded reality, the opposite of the HOA's paper-pushing world. I began by laying out the evidence. Letters threatening fines over the color of my shutters, citations for supposed violations that did not exist, harassment disguised as compliance checks, and most disturbingly, the minutes from board meetings where Karen had openly stated her intent to make an example out of me for daring to question her authority. The judge listened carefully, nodding occasionally, but his expression remained neutral, a practiced mask that revealed nothing of his personal thoughts. Still, I sensed that he understood the gravity of what I was showing him, not just petty grievances, but a pattern of abuse of power that undermined basic rights. As I spoke, the wind shifted outside, carrying with it the sound of waves lapping against the dock, and I remember thinking how strange it was that such a serene setting could also be the backdrop for the kind of conflict that corrodes communities. I told the judge about the threats I had received when I refused to pay a bogus fine, about the time Karen had marched up to my front porch with 2 board members in tow, demanding entry to inspect my property without a warrant or even legitimate cause, and about the way she had rallied some neighbors with promises of power while intimidating others into silence. The judge interjected only a few times, asking precise questions, the kind that cut to the heart of matters. Were there bylaws supporting her actions? Had I documented each incident? Did I ever respond in writing? Yes, yes, and yes. I had learned long ago that the only way to survive a war with an HOA was to document everything, to leave a paper trail that could withstand scrutiny. As we delved deeper into the thick stack of papers, I could feel the weight of vindication building. At last, someone with authority beyond the HOA bubble was seeing the truth, and perhaps, just perhaps, justice would follow. But just as I was pointing out a particularly damning piece of evidence, a recorded transcript where Karen referred to herself as the sovereign protector of the neighborhood, the cabin door burst open without warning. The hinges rattled, the frame shook, and there she was in all her furious glory. Karen herself, storming into my family's cabin as though she had every right to invade a private meeting between a citizen and a federal judge. Her hair was perfectly styled, her blouse pressed, and in her hand was the inevitable clipboard, gripped like a weapon, the papers upon it fluttering with the sudden rush of air. "What is the meaning of this?" she screeched, her voice piercing the calm like a siren. "You think you can plot against me in secret? In my jurisdiction?" The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed but silently observing, perhaps curious to see the very character we had been dissecting brought to life in dramatic fashion. My heart pounded, not from fear, but from the sheer audacity of her intrusion, the way she had crossed every imaginable line of propriety, legality, and decency. I stood to face her, my hands steady though adrenaline surged through me, and I said firmly, "Karen, this is my property. You have no authority here. You are trespassing." But she ignored me, of course, her eyes fixed instead on the judge, as though she recognized his importance, yet believed she could intimidate him the same way she bullied neighbors into submission. "And who are you?" she demanded, pointing the tip of her pen toward him as if it were a dagger. The judge leaned back slightly, his expression cool, and introduced himself in the most understated way possible. "I am a United States District Judge." The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the faint sound of the lake outside. For the first time, I saw a flicker of uncertainty in Karen's eyes, a tiny crack in the armor of her self-righteousness, but it quickly hardened again into defiance. "I don't care who you are," she snapped, though her voice had lost some of its force. "This is HOA business, and I will not allow conspiracies to undermine the rules we live by." The judge glanced at me, then back at her, and with deliberate calm said, "Ma'am, you are interfering in a private legal consultation. I suggest you leave." That was the moment I realized this battle had escalated into something far larger than I had anticipated. The collision of personal vendetta, local tyranny, and federal authority was now unfolding in real time, and the storm that had been building was only beginning to break. Karen did not move an inch despite the judge's calm but firm instruction to leave, and instead she squared her shoulders, clutching her clipboard like it was both a shield and a sword, her jaw tightening as though she had been waiting her entire life for this moment of confrontation. And I could see in her eyes the burning certainty of someone who believed beyond all reason that she alone was the guardian of law, order, and morality within the confines of our neighborhood. She launched into a tirade, her words spilling out like a flood that could not be contained, accusing me of being a troublemaker, a scofflaw, a danger to the integrity of the community. And then she turned her fury on the judge himself, though she still had not fully grasped the gravity of who she was speaking to, telling him that he was trespassing on HOA jurisdiction and that any deliberations or secret proceedings held here would be null and void without the board sanction, and I could hardly believe the gall of her statements, because even after being told she was addressing a federal judge, she clung to her imagined supremacy with the same desperation a drowning person clings to driftwood. The judge did not raise his voice, nor did he betray anger. Instead, he watched her with the steady gaze of someone who had seen egos of every size crumble before the weight of law, and then, in a voice calm enough to be mistaken for kindness, he asked, "Do you have legal documentation granting you authority to intrude upon private property and interfere with legal consultation?" Karen blinked rapidly, her mouth opening and closing like a fish, but instead of conceding, she doubled down, waving her clipboard as though it were a badge, declaring that the HOA bylaws gave her authority to inspect, monitor, and regulate any property under its jurisdiction at any time. And she even attempted to quote specific sections, though she twisted them grotesquely, pulling clauses out of context and stringing them together into something that bore little resemblance to the actual text. I had the original bylaws sitting in one of my binders, and I quickly flipped to the page she was referencing, sliding it across the table to the judge, so he could see the stark difference between what she was claiming and what was written. The actual clause stated that inspections could only be conducted with prior notice, consent, or in extreme cases with a legal warrant, none of which applied here, and the judge's eyes flicked back and forth between the two versions, Karen's frantic reinterpretation and the plain words on the page, before he set the binder down with quiet finality. "That is not what it says," he told her, and though his tone was even, it carried the weight of authority, the kind that strips bluster bare and leaves no room for argument. Karen's face flushed crimson, and she sputtered, trying to regain momentum, but the judge cut her off with a raised hand, commanding silence without needing to shout. "You are trespassing," he reminded her, "and you are interfering in matters that may involve federal oversight." If you continue, I will have no choice but to consider legal action against you personally. That should have ended it. Any rational person would have backed down, perhaps even apologized, but Karen was not rational. She was fueled by the intoxicating belief that rules, when twisted to her advantage, gave her untouchable power. She straightened her posture again, her voice rising in a shrill crescendo, as she declared that the judge himself would be reported to the HOA board for misconduct, that I would be fined into bankruptcy, that the community would rise against me for daring to betray the rules, and she seemed genuinely convinced that her threats carried more weight than the authority of a United States government. My anger simmered, but the judge remained collected, jotting down a note with deliberate calmness as though her tantrum were merely evidence being recorded for the inevitable consequences. I could see the shift happening in real time. Karen's fury, her desperate attempt to maintain control, was digging her deeper into a hole she did not realize she was creating, and the judge was letting her patiently, silently, waiting for her to hang herself with her own words. After nearly 5 solid minutes of ranting, her voice hoarse but her determination unshaken, she tried a new tactic, turning to me directly, wagging her pen like a scolding finger, and saying that by inviting outsiders into her community, I had violated the HOA charter and could therefore be stripped of my ownership rights. That was the moment I actually laughed, a sharp bark of incredulity that cut through the tension, because ownership rights are not something an HOA can revoke, no matter how much its president wishes they could. The judge, too, allowed himself the faintest curl of a smile before responding, "Ma'am, property rights are not contingent on HOA charters. You have no authority to revoke ownership. The very suggestion is absurd." The word absurd seemed to strike her like a slap, and she recoiled slightly, her eyes narrowing into slits of pure venom. But instead of retreating, she leaned forward, lowering her voice into a conspiratorial hiss as she accused me of conspiring to dismantle the HOA entirely, of planning some kind of neighborhood coup, and she demanded that the judge cease all contact with me lest he become complicit in my supposed rebellion. At this point, it was almost surreal, like watching a play in which the villain doesn't realize the audience has stopped sympathizing and is now laughing at their delusions, and I had to restrain myself from pointing out how unhinged she sounded because I knew the judge's silent observation was far more damning than any retort I could deliver. Finally, after another tense pause, the judge rose to his feet, towering over Karen not in height alone, but in the sheer gravity of his presence, and he said with deliberate clarity, "This conversation is over. You will leave this property now, or I will contact the sheriff's office immediately." For the first time, Karen faltered. Her mouth opened, but no words came out, and her eyes darted from the judge to me and back again as though she were calculating her next move. Yet she seemed to realize that even her boundless audacity had limits when faced with the possibility of criminal trespass charges. She muttered something under her breath, an incoherent string of defiance mixed with indignation, then spun on her heel and stormed out the door, slamming it behind her so hard the windows rattled in their frames. The silence that followed was almost as loud as her shouting had been, and I exhaled slowly, realizing I had been holding my breath through most of the exchange. The judge adjusted his jacket, sat back down, and with the calm of a man who had weathered many storms said, "Well, that was illuminating." We both chuckled then, a brief moment of levity in what had otherwise been a confrontation laced with venom. But I knew in that moment the battle was far from over, because Karen was not the type to accept defeat quietly, and her retreat was not a surrender. It was merely the eye of the storm, a pause before she regrouped and struck again with even greater fury. The judge and I had barely regained our composure after Karen's dramatic exit when the reality of what had just occurred began to settle in, and I knew deep down that her storming away was not a conclusion, but a prelude, a regrouping before she returned with reinforcements, because Karen was not someone who admitted defeat, not even when cornered by facts, law, and common sense. She thrived on escalation, on dragging others into her crusades, on convincing herself, and anyone gullible enough to, listen that she was the victim of some grand conspiracy, and sure enough, within hours, the first signs of her retaliation began to ripple across the community like shockwaves from a thrown stone hitting calm water. While the judge and I pored over the remaining documents, discussing possible legal remedies and the extent of federal oversight that might apply, my phone began buzzing incessantly with notifications, emails from neighbors, text messages filled with panic or confusion, and even a few threatening voicemails. All of them revolving around the sudden narrative Karen had begun spreading that I was plotting to dismantle the HOA, to steal property rights, and to turn our once peaceful neighborhood into a lawless wasteland. Her words, absurd as they were, had ignited fear in those too timid to question her authority, and within no time she had rallied a group of loyal board members who were eager to prove their devotion by turning the screws on me even harder. One neighbor emailed to inform me that Karen had convened an emergency HOA meeting, not at the clubhouse as per protocol, but on her front lawn, complete with folding chairs, a megaphone, and a stack of freshly printed flyers accusing me of crimes that ranged from harboring outsiders to endangering community safety, and the language was so inflammatory that even the judge, upon seeing a copy I forwarded to him, shook his head in disbelief and remarked that it bordered on libel. The escalation didn't stop with rumors and meetings. By the next morning, I found bright orange notices taped to my mailbox, my gate, and even my truck windshield, all stamped with the HOA's logo and declaring that I was now facing fines in the thousands for unauthorized gatherings and unapproved legal activity, as if sitting with a judge in my privately owned cabin required HOA permission. It was harassment taken to an entirely new level, a campaign of intimidation designed not just to punish, but to isolate me, to turn the entire neighborhood into a jury against me before any real court could intervene. The judge, to his credit, remained unshaken. He advised me to document everything, photograph every notice, record every voicemail, and keep a running log of Karen's escalating tactics, because what had started as overreach was now crossing into clear violations of harassment and abuse of authority that could carry significant consequences if brought before the proper venue. But Karen was clever in her madness. She knew how to exploit the fear of neighbors who simply wanted peace and quiet, twisting their anxieties into weapons, painting me not as a man standing up for his rights, but as a disruptive outsider. And she even distributed a petition demanding my removal from the community, which, though legally meaningless, created the illusion of legitimacy in the eyes of those unwilling to challenge her. I caught sight of her one afternoon strutting down the street with a small entourage of board members behind her, clipboards in hand, going door to door as if leading a political campaign, her voice carrying across the yards as she proclaimed that I was colluding with the government to strip the community of its freedoms, a statement so twisted in irony that I almost laughed, because here was the woman who fined children for chalk drawings accusing me of tyranny. The tension in the neighborhood grew palpable. Some neighbors avoided eye contact with me altogether, crossing the street when they saw me walking, while others, braver souls who had long resented Karen's reign but feared her wrath, quietly slipped me words of encouragement, whispering that they admired what I was doing but couldn't afford to get involved. The divide was stark, and it only fueled Karen's theatrics, because she thrived on creating an us versus them narrative, casting herself as the protector of order against my supposed anarchy. The judge, meanwhile, began making discreet inquiries of his own, consulting with legal colleagues and reviewing the HOA's governing documents, and though he remained professional and impartial, I could see the flicker of indignation in his eyes, the recognition that what we were facing here was not just a nuisance, but a microcosm of power gone unchecked, the kind of petty tyranny that, left unchallenged, metastasizes into larger injustices. It was during one of our follow-up meetings at the cabin, held with doors locked and curtains drawn just in case, that we were interrupted again, this time not by Karen herself, but by a caravan of HOA loyalists who marched onto my property carrying signs, chanting slogans like "Protect Our Rules" and "Stop the Rebellion," their voices echoing across the quiet lake like a parody of protest movements. Yet their determination was chilling because it showed just how far Karen's influence had spread. I stood at the window with the judge at my side, watching them trespass on my land, their signs waving like accusations in the summer air, and I knew then that this was no longer about fines or bylaws. This had become a battle for the very soul of the neighborhood, a test of whether reason and rights could withstand the fury of one woman's obsession. The judge advised me not to confront them directly, at least not yet, but instead to call the sheriff's office and file a report, which I did, though I half expected the deputies to dismiss it as a civil matter like they so often did with HOA complaints. To my surprise, when the deputies arrived, they took one look at the scene. Dozens of residents on my property with no permission chanting under Karen's direction, and their demeanor shifted. This was no longer a trivial neighborhood squabble, but an unlawful assembly, and the deputies wasted no time dispersing the crowd, warning Karen that if she organized such an event again without permits, she would face criminal charges. The look on her face as the deputies ordered her off my property was priceless, a mix of outrage, disbelief, and the dawning horror of realizing that her reign might not be as invincible as she imagined. Yet, even as she retreated once more, barking promises that this was far from over, I could see the dangerous glint in her eyes, the kind of stubborn fury that meant she would only escalate further, and I felt a chill run through me despite the warm summer air, because Karen was not done. She was merely regrouping for her boldest, most reckless move yet. In the days following the deputy's intervention, the air in the neighborhood grew thick with tension, the kind you could feel pressing against your chest as you walked past shuttered blinds and watched neighbors whisper behind cupped hands, and it became obvious that Karen was plotting her next move. Because someone like her didn't stop when faced with warnings, she doubled down, convinced that every rebuke was not a consequence of her own actions, but proof of a conspiracy against her. Authority, and sure enough, within a week I received a certified letter, thick with papers, announcing that the HOA, under Karen's leadership, had officially filed a civil complaint against me for community endangerment, willful noncompliance, and breach of charter, a collection of charges so outlandish that the judge himself nearly laughed when I showed him the documents, though his laughter was tempered with the knowledge that we now had a formal battleground: the courtroom. Karen had forced the matter into legal proceedings, thinking, I am certain, that her sheer audacity and the illusion of authority stamped across HOA paperwork would intimidate me into surrender. But she had miscalculated, because this was no longer just my fight. It was a case that had the attention of a federal judge who had personally witnessed her trespass and abuse of power, and together we began preparing to meet her not on her lawn with megaphones, but in a court of law, where bluster would be weighed against fact. The day of the hearing arrived like the breaking of a storm. The courthouse was abuzz with gossip because news of Karen's antics had spread far beyond our neighborhood, and people came out of curiosity to see whether the notorious HOA queen would finally meet her reckoning. I walked in with my binders of meticulously documented evidence, every notice, every email, every recording preserved like ammunition, and beside me walked the judge, not in his official capacity for this hearing, but as a witness willing to testify about what he had observed firsthand, a presence so commanding that even the clerk at the desk straightened with a startled jolt when she recognized him. Across the aisle sat Karen, flanked by two nervous-looking board members clutching folders, and though she tried to wear the mask of confidence, her eyes darted restlessly, betraying the undercurrent of panic she could not completely conceal. She had traded her clipboard for a stack of papers she believed would condemn me, but I knew, and she suspected, that her arguments would wither under scrutiny. When the proceedings began, her attorney, a local lawyer whose discomfort was palpable as though he realized too late the madness of the case he had taken, rose to present the complaint, citing bylaws and clauses in a tone meant to sound authoritative, but each point he raised was flimsy, built on distortions of text or outright fabrications that unraveled the moment they were cross-examined. My turn came, and I spoke not with fire or theatrics, but with calm precision, laying out the timeline of harassment, the unlawful notices, the trespass, and most damning of all, the incident at the cabin where Karen had barged in uninvited during my meeting with a federal judge. And when the judge himself took the stand, his testimony carried the weight of thunder, his words steady and unyielding as he described her behavior, her false claims of jurisdiction, and her blatant disregard for the law. And with every sentence, I could see Karen shrinking, her bravado crumbling like a facade under a hammer. Yet even then, she could not remain silent. When the judge stated plainly that her interpretation of the bylaws was absurd and unfounded, she leapt to her feet, pointing at him and shouting that he was corrupt, that he was colluding with me to destroy the HOA, and that she would take this all the way to the Supreme Court if necessary. The outburst was met with gasps from the gallery, murmurs rippling like waves, and the presiding judge, distinct from my ally, struck his gavel sharply, warning her to sit down or face contempt charges, but Karen, true to form, had no concept of restraint, and she continued to shout, her voice cracking under the strain, until the bailiff was ordered to escort her back to her seat. The courtroom had become a theater of her downfall, and as the presiding judge delivered his decision, it was as though the storm finally broke. The complaint filed against me was dismissed in its entirety, declared frivolous and without merit, and furthermore, the court found grounds to sanction the HOA for abuse of process, opening the door to personal liability for Karen and her board members should they continue their campaign of harassment. The words landed like hammer blows, final and irreversible, and in that moment the room seemed to exhale the collective breath of people who had witnessed justice triumph over arrogance. Karen's face was a mask of disbelief, her lips trembling as though forming protests that could no longer find purchase, and when the gavel fell one last time, sealing the decision, she slumped in her chair, her clipboard lying forgotten at her feet like a discarded crown. I left the courthouse that day with the weight of months of conflict lifting from my shoulders, the sunlight outside brighter than it had seemed in years, and though I knew Karen would never truly change, people like her rarely do, I also knew that her power had been broken, her aura of untouchable authority shattered before the eyes of the very community she had terrorized. In the weeks that followed, neighbors who had once avoided me now came forward to apologize, to thank me for standing firm, to admit that they too had suffered under Karen's rule, but had been too afraid to speak, and slowly, the neighborhood began to heal, its lawns and driveways no longer patrolled by a self-appointed despot with a clipboard, but shared freely by people who remembered that communities are built on respect, not domination. As for the cabin by the lake, it remained my sanctuary, but now it held a deeper meaning, a reminder of the battle fought, and one within its walls of the day a storm blew in and was met not with surrender but with steadfast resolve, and sometimes when I sit on the porch and watch the sun sink into the still waters, I think back to the moment Karen barged through that door, believing herself invincible, only to discover that no amount of bluster can withstand the steady force of truth and law.